The silence in my apartment was usually my sanctuary, the quiet space where I created worlds and voices for other people. But that Tuesday, the silence felt incredibly heavy, suffocating, and thick with a fever that had been burning through my system for 3 long days. I was 42 years old, completely alone, and curled up on my sofa, wrapped in 2 thick blankets, shivering violently despite the thermostat being pushed all the way up to 75 degrees. My throat felt like it had been scrubbed raw with steel wool, and my head pounded with a relentless rhythm that made just opening my eyes a deliberate, painful effort. I reached for my phone on the coffee table. I didn't want to work. I simply needed to distract myself from the deep, throbbing aches in my joints. I just wanted to see something mindless. A recipe video, a cat meme, literally anything to pass the time until the next dose of ibuprofen finally kicked in and offered me some relief. My thumb hovered over the social media icon. I hesitated. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew, historically speaking, that opening that particular app during a holiday week was an act of emotional self-harm. But the fever made me weak, and human curiosity is an incredibly cruel instinct. I tapped the screen. The first image that loaded onto my feed was a high-definition, sun-drenched nightmare. It was a group selfie. The water behind them was that impossible, crystalline blue that you only ever see in heavily edited travel brochures for the Maldives or Bora Bora. There was a massive white yacht gleaming brightly under the tropical sun. And there, crowded into the frame, grinning with brilliant white teeth and clinking flutes of expensive champagne, was my entire family. My older sister Bianca was front and center, wearing a wide-brimmed designer hat and oversized sunglasses, her arm draped possessively over her husband Derek. My niece Sienna and my nephew Julian were posing casually in the background, looking impossibly tan and happy. Even my parents, Richard and Margaret, were there. They looked younger than they had in years, holding tropical cocktails and laughing at something just off camera. Beneath the photo, Bianca had written a caption that read, "Annual Family Reset. Nothing matters more than making memories with the people who mean the most. Family first, blessed out life." I stared at the screen until the glowing pixels seemed to blur together. Family first. I let the phone slip from my numb fingers onto the rug. The thud sounded incredibly loud in my dark, empty living room. I hadn't even known they were going away. Usually, there was at least a courtesy lie. A vague mention from my mother that they might go camping, or that they were just doing a quiet staycation this year. But this was a full-blown, 5-star luxury excursion. It had been planned, booked, and executed without a single word to me. I wasn't just uninvited. I was completely erased. I tried to swallow, but the pain in my throat flared, sharp and intensely hot. Tears pricked my eyes, not from the physical sickness, but from the sudden, crushing, suffocating weight of my isolation. I was lying here, unable to even muster the strength to make myself a bowl of soup, while the very people who shared my DNA were halfway across the world, toasting to family unity on a private yacht. It wasn't the first time they had done this. It was, in fact, the 10th year in a row. But this time, seeing the sheer extravagance of it, the deliberate, coordinated exclusion felt different. It felt surgical. They hadn't just forgotten to ask if I wanted to come. They had held a meeting, looked at the guest list, and made a conscious choice that I did not belong in that picture. I closed my eyes, but the image of Bianca's triumphant, perfect smile was burned permanently into my retinas. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, shivering violently now. I was alone. Completely and utterly alone. And as the fevered dreams began to take over my mind, mixing with the harsh reality of my family's rejection, I realized something that chilled me far more deeply than the illness ever could. The betrayal of being forgotten by your own blood was significantly worse than the diagnosis itself. The fever finally broke 2 days later, leaving me feeling hollowed out, weak in the knees, but possessed by a cold, crystalline clarity that I hadn't felt in years. I spent the entire morning aggressively scrubbing my apartment, desperate to purge the stale smell of sickness and misery from the air. As I wiped down the dark granite countertops of my kitchen, countertops in an apartment my family had never once bothered to visit because they claimed it was too far out of their way, I replayed the last decade of my life in my mind. The exclusion had started subtly. 10 years ago, when I was 28, I made the terrifying but necessary decision to quit my soul-crushing corporate marketing job to pursue my dream of writing full-time. To my sister Bianca, her husband Derek, and my parents, taking a creative risk was strictly synonymous with being unemployed. They saw me sitting at local coffee shops with a laptop, typing away for hours, and immediately assumed I was utterly destitute. They saw me wearing comfortable sweaters and leggings instead of tailored power suits, and they collectively assumed I had just given up on life. I remember the family gatherings. Bianca would hold court by the appetizer table, sipping wine and talking about me as if I weren't standing right there. She would tell our relatives that Valerie was just finding herself, her voice dripping with a sickly, patronizing sweetness. She would sigh dramatically and say that I was living a very simple life right now and that I was very budget-conscious. The first major exclusion happened that very summer. They all went to a luxury resort in Cancun. When I eventually found out through a stray Facebook post, Bianca had just laughed, waving a perfectly manicured hand in my face. She called me sweetie and told me they didn't invite me because they knew I couldn't afford the buy-in. She made sure to mention it was $2,000 a head just for the resort and claimed they simply didn't want to embarrass me by asking me to spend money I didn't have. I had swallowed my pride and accepted that excuse. I was struggling financially back then as I built my portfolio, so her logic, however cruelly delivered, wasn't entirely wrong. But the very next year, it was a lavish ski trip to Aspen. This time, Derek was the one to deliver the blow. He clapped me hard on the shoulder and told me that I didn't ski anyway. He chuckled and added that, frankly, I was a bit too quiet for their group. He said the evenings in Aspen were for partying, and that I would just be bored stiff sitting by the fire. Boring. That quickly became my permanent label in the family. Boring and broke. As I scrubbed a particularly stubborn coffee stain off the kitchen counter, I let out a dry, humorless laugh. It echoed off the bare walls. If only they knew the reality of my so-called simple life. If only they understood that my quiet existence wasn't a punishment, but a fortress of solitude that I desperately needed in order to do my work. They didn't know that the little freelance writing gigs I vaguely mentioned at Thanksgiving dinners were actually highly lucrative ghostwriting contracts. I was the hidden voice behind some of the biggest celebrity memoirs and CEO thrillers currently sitting on the New York Times bestseller list. They saw me driving my reliable, 5-year-old Honda Civic and instantly assumed I drove it because I couldn't afford a Tesla. They didn't know that I had well over $2 million sitting quietly in a heavily diversified index fund portfolio. They had no idea that my boring, quiet nights at home were actually spent managing a rapidly growing real estate holding company that I had legally established under a private LLC. I wasn't boring because I lacked imagination. I was boring because I was too busy building a financial empire that their superficial minds couldn't even begin to comprehend. Suddenly, my phone buzzed violently on the counter. The screen lit up with a caller ID I hadn't seen in weeks. It was Bianca. I stared at the glowing screen. They must be back. The grand, exclusionary Family First tour had officially concluded. I let it ring twice before I picked it up, putting it on speakerphone as I aggressively dried a ceramic plate with a dish towel. I kept my voice flat, betraying absolutely no emotion as I greeted her. Bianca's voice chirped through the tiny speaker, loud and completely devoid of genuine concern. She told me I sounded terrible and asked, almost as an afterthought, if I was sick. I told her I was recovering, keeping my answers as short as possible. I asked her how the trip was, knowing full well what she was going to say. She didn't even try to hide her gloating. She asked if I saw the photos, sounding entirely unapologetic. She launched into a monologue about how magical it all was. She made sure to tell me that I would have hated it anyway, complaining about the heat and the walking before bragging about how Derek got them onto a private yacht where they drank champagne for 6 solid hours. She emphasized how loud and high energy it was, driving home the point that it was definitely not my scene. I gripped the dish towel tightly in my hands, my knuckles turning white. I agreed with her softly, repeating her words. Not my scene. She didn't pause to let me speak. She just kept talking, barely taking a breath. She announced that they had brought me back a souvenir magnet. She said they were going to swing by my neighborhood to drop it off and maybe grab a quick lunch. She casually mentioned that her daughter, Sienna, wanted to eat at an expensive bistro nearby, but Bianca had told her that Aunt Valerie would probably prefer to go somewhere more affordable, like that cheap diner I used to frequent. The condescension dripped from the phone speaker like toxic sludge. A magnet. My entire family went to the Mediterranean for a luxury vacation, purposely hid it from me, and their grand gesture of familial love was bringing me back a cheap refrigerator magnet. I kept my voice remarkably steady. I lied and told her I was too busy with work deadlines that day to meet up. Bianca let out a loud, theatrical sigh. She muttered something about me always working so hard just to scrape by for pennies. Before she hung up, she offered a parting piece of unasked for advice, telling me I needed to get out more because I was turning into a hermit and that it was honestly depressing for them to watch. The line went dead before I could even formulate a response. I stood frozen in the middle of my kitchen, the profound silence of my apartment rushing back in to fill the void. A hermit. Depressing. Pennies. I looked around my living space. It was nice, yes. It was clean and well kept, but it was undeniably modest. It was the perfect camouflage I had carefully worn for an entire decade. But as I looked at the magnet holding up a takeout menu on my fridge, a beautiful ceramic souvenir from a month-long trip I had taken solo to Kyoto the previous year, a trip I had fully paid for in cash without telling a single soul, I felt a sudden, seismic shift in my chest. I walked out of the kitchen, down the short hallway and into my home office. I bypassed my computer monitors and went straight for the bottom drawer of my heavy mahogany desk, using a small silver key to unlock it. Inside was a thick, pristine manila envelope. It had arrived via secure courier a few days ago, right in the middle of my delirious fever haze, and I hadn't even had the energy to open it yet. I grabbed a silver letter opener, sliced through the tape at the top, and slid the heavy, high-quality paper contents out onto the smooth surface of my desk. It was a property deed. Specifically, the deed to a sprawling estate on the island of Exuma in the Bahamas. This wasn't a timeshare or a temporary summer rental. It was a massive, 6-bedroom beachfront villa complete with a private infinity pool, a separate guest house, and direct, private access to a sapphire blue lagoon. I had bought the entire property outright, paid in full, just 3 weeks ago. It was my own private celebration for successfully closing a massive, 6-figure book deal that my family would never know about. I slowly ran my fingertips over the raised, embossed golden seal on the legal document. Boring, I whispered aloud to the empty room. Broke. My family thought they had me completely figured out. They thought they understood the rigid hierarchy of our bloodline. Bianca was the untouchable queen, Derek was the king, and I was just the pathetic court jester, forever waiting by the table, begging for their discarded scraps. But in their arrogance, they had forgotten one incredibly crucial detail about human nature. The quietest person in the room is usually the one who is listening the hardest. And more often than not, the quiet one is the person who holds all the keys. To truly understand why their exclusion cut me so deeply, to understand the raw, festering wound beneath my stoic exterior, you have to understand exactly what I sacrificed for them. My current wealth wasn't just a product of hard work, it was a rebellion against a past that had almost broken me. When I was 22, freshly out of college with a useless degree and big dreams, and Bianca was 26, our parents went through a brutal, devastating financial rough patch. My father, Richard, made some terrible investments and lost his small business overnight. The bank came knocking, relentlessly threatening immediate foreclosure on the home we had all grown up in. At the time, Bianca was living out in Los Angeles, supposedly passionately pursuing her acting career. In reality, her career mostly consisted of spending money our family didn't have on expensive, glossy headshots and elite acting classes that she rarely bothered to attend. When the bank notices turned red, Bianca didn't come home. I did. I was the one who packed up my meager apartment and moved back into my childhood bedroom. I was the one who put my own life on absolute hold. I took a grueling, soul-crushing night shift job at a massive logistics warehouse. I spent 10 hours a night stacking heavy cardboard boxes until the skin on my hands cracked and bled, just to contribute every single cent of my weekly paycheck to my parents' mortgage so they wouldn't end up sleeping on the streets. I lived that nightmare for 2 solid years. During those 24 months of my physical and emotional labor, Bianca never sent a single dime back home to help. In fact, it was quite the opposite. She would call our mother late at night, crying hysterically about how brutally hard her life in Hollywood was, complaining about the cost of organic groceries and networking parties. And my mother, Margaret, would secretly wire her money. She wired Bianca the very money that I had just deposited into the family account to pay for our basic groceries and keep the electricity on. I remember the night I found out. I had found a bank receipt on the kitchen counter. When I confronted my mother about it, exhausted and smelling of warehouse dust, she hadn't even apologized. She just let out a long, heavy sigh and reached out to pat my calloused hand. She told me that I was so incredibly strong. She said I could handle the heavy burdens of life. But Bianca, she explained with a wavering voice, Bianca was delicate. She needed more support than I did. She was special. Special. That single, heavily loaded word became the defining metric of our entire lives. Bianca was special, therefore she was entitled to grace and funding. I was strong, therefore I was destined to carry the weight. Bianca was the beautiful, tragic protagonist of our family's story. I was just the reliable, invisible supporting crew. Now, at 46 years old, Bianca had completely rebranded herself. She had long given up the delusion of being an actress. She now called herself a lifestyle consultant and a social media personality. As far as I could tell, she didn't actually do anything tangible or produce any real value in the world. Her entire full-time job consisted of meticulously curating a digital image of effortless, generational wealth. Her social media feed was a carousel of reviews for high-end day spas, which I knew for a fact she relentlessly pestered for free entry in exchange for exposure. She offered her followers vague, meaningless advice about manifesting financial abundance, and she wore designer clothing that cost more than my first 2 cars combined. Derek, her husband, was the absolute perfect accessory for her grand illusion. In reality, he was just a mid-level regional manager at a mid-sized logistics firm. But if you listened to Bianca talk at family dinners, you would walk away believing Derek was a ruthless titan of industry, closing multi-million-dollar deals before breakfast. They lived in a massive, sprawling colonial house in a gated community that was entirely too big for a family of 4. They drove heavily leased luxury SUVs, and they carried a mountain of revolving credit card debt that would make a seasoned investment banker weep in terror. But none of that mattered to my parents. Bianca and Derek looked the part. And in my family's deeply flawed value system, the glossy appearance of success was always vastly more important than the boring, mathematical reality of actual solvency. A week after the infamous family first yacht trip concluded, I was finally feeling physically well enough to attend the mandatory, post-vacation Sunday dinner at my parents' house. I parked my old Honda on the street behind Derek's gleaming leased SUV, took a deep breath to steady my nerves, and walked through the front door, bracing myself for the inevitable onslaught. The living room had already been transformed into a dedicated shrine honoring their luxurious vacation. My mother had somehow found the time to print and frame 6 photos of the yacht, placing them prominently on the fireplace mantel for everyone to admire. Sienna, my 20-year-old niece who was allegedly studying fashion marketing at college, but mostly just majored in online shopping, was sprawled on the sofa, mindlessly scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging my entrance. Julian, my 18-year-old nephew, was slouched in a recliner, playing a violent video game on the television with the volume turned up to an absolutely ear-splitting level. Hearing the front door close, Bianca practically floated out of the kitchen. She was holding a large glass of chilled Chardonnay, looking impossibly tan, radiant, and undeniably expensive. She cried out my name with fake enthusiasm. She glided over to me and offered a delicate, practiced air kiss hovering inches near my cheek, being extremely careful not to let my supposedly cheap clothes smudge her flawless makeup. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of pity, and told me I looked a little better, though she made sure to add that I was still looking quite pale and tired. I kept my expression neutral, told her I was fine, and placed a bottle of wine I had brought on the dining table. It was a rare, vintage Bordeaux that I had pulled from my private cellar. It was worth well over $300, but I had specifically chosen it because the label looked incredibly understated. I knew they wouldn't bother to research it or know the difference. They would blindly drink it, assume it was a cheap $20 grocery store pick because I was the one who brought it, and judge me for my lack of taste. Derek boomed into the room, walking in from the backyard patio. He was a physically large man who always seemed to take up far too much space in any room he entered, always speaking too loudly, constantly asserting his dominance over every conversation. He immediately asked if I had seen the pictures. He didn't wait for an answer before launching into a brag about how incredible the yacht was, loudly claiming the captain told him it was the exact same model that Leonardo DiCaprio frequently rents for his private parties. I forced a tight, polite smile and told him it looked lovely, working hard to keep my voice completely neutral. Derek winked at me, swirling his drink. He admitted it was incredibly expensive, but then offered me a piece of uninvited life advice. He said you simply can't put a price tag on family experiences. He told me I really needed to live a little, asking me what the point was of hoarding all my pennies in my depressing little apartment. I calmly poured myself a glass of iced water from the pitcher on the table. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was actually quite happy with my life. Bianca leaned elegantly against the kitchen counter, taking a slow sip of her wine. Her eyes narrowed slightly, zeroing in on me. She had a predator's natural instinct for sniffing out weakness, and right now, she was actively scanning me for a vulnerability to exploit. She casually mentioned that Sienna had told her she saw me at the international airport about 3 weeks ago, right before I got sick. I froze, the glass of water stopping halfway to my mouth. I hadn't seen Sienna at the airport. I had no idea she was even there. I quickly formulated a lie, my heart rate spiking. I set the glass down and told Bianca I was just there dropping off a friend for a flight. Bianca raised an overly plucked eyebrow. She took another slow sip of her wine, her sharp eyes never leaving my face. She challenged my lie, stating that Sienna had specifically seen me standing in the international first-class departures line. And more importantly, she noted that Sienna said I was carrying that particular Louis Vuitton carry-on bag. The very same bag I had previously told Bianca was just a cheap street knockoff. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs, loud enough that I was sure they could hear it. 3 weeks ago, I hadn't been dropping anyone off. I had been flying first class to Nassau to sign the final, massive stack of closing papers on the Bahamas villa. I had worn a hat and sunglasses, desperately hoping I was invisible to the world. I forced a light, dismissive laugh. I assured her the bag was indeed a knockoff, just a very convincing one I bought online. I doubled down on my lie, saying I wasn't traveling, but just seeing a demanding client off at the gate. Bianca's skepticism was palpable. She questioned since when freelance ghostwriters had the kind of wealthy clients who fly international first class. She mocked my career, asking if I didn't usually just write cheap articles for mommy bloggers. I murmured a vague agreement, looking away. Satisfied that she had put me back in my place, Bianca pushed off the counter and walked slowly toward me. She stopped uncomfortably close. She smelled strongly of an overpowering, expensive floral perfume and deep-seated condescension. She lowered her voice, adopting a tone of fake, sisterly concern. She told me that if I was truly struggling financially, I could just tell them, and they could try to help. She offered to give me some of her old, discarded clothes she was planning to donate. She suggested that wearing her used designer labels might help me look more professional and attract better, higher-paying writing opportunities. To punctuate her insult, she reached out her perfectly manicured hand and casually flicked the collar of the simple, black button-down blouse I was wearing. She crinkled her nose and asked if the fabric was stiff because it was cheap polyester. The insult wasn't clumsy. It was a highly precise, calculated strike. It was expertly designed to shove me aggressively back into my designated box. I was the poor, pathetic sister, the eternal charity case of the family. Instead of shrinking away or apologizing for my existence like I usually did, I stood my ground. I looked at my sister. I really, truly looked at her for the first time in years, bypassing the glowing tan and the expensive makeup. When I looked closely, I saw the fine, rigid lines of intense tightness around her eyes, a kind of tension that expensive Botox couldn't quite mask. It was the distinct look of chronic, exhausting stress. I shifted my gaze to Derek. I noticed the specific, obsessive way he constantly checked his phone screen, hastily swiping away notifications and shielding the screen from view with his hand. He wasn't casually checking sports scores. He was dodging urgent emails or screening calls from aggressive debt collectors. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. I saw the frantic, desperate, buzzing energy vibrating just beneath their glamorous, curated surface. They were kicking wildly underwater, slowly drowning in the immense weight of their own fabricated image. And there I stood, the quiet, boring sister, secretly acting as the ultimate financial lifeline they didn't even know existed. I reached up and gently, but firmly, brushed her hand away from my collar. I kept my voice soft, but layered it with steel. I told her the shirt was actually pure silk. I looked her in the eyes and calmly stated that I didn't need her old clothes, but thanked her for the offer anyway. Bianca visibly recoiled. She took a half-step back, clearly surprised by my sudden flash of backbone. Her eyes narrowed even further into dangerous slits. She sensed something was off. She couldn't quite name what it was, but her predatory instincts told her that the fundamental dynamic of power in the room was subtly shifting away from her. Her fake concern vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, icy glare. She told me to suit myself, her voice hard. She couldn't resist one final twist of the knife, telling me she just hated seeing me live such a pathetic life while they were out traveling and enjoying the absolute best the world had to offer. She sneered and muttered that it was actually quite embarrassing for them to have a sister who didn't live, but merely existed. She turned her back on me dismissively and walked briskly into the dining room, loudly announcing to the rest of the house that dinner was ready. She clapped her hands and enthusiastically told everyone to come to the table so they could tell poor Valerie all about their exclusive caviar tasting on the yacht. I didn't follow her immediately. I stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment, staring blankly at her retreating back. The deep-seated anger that had been simmering quietly in my chest for over a decade began to rapidly approach a rolling boil. But strangely, it wasn't a chaotic, hot, blinding anger anymore. It was cold. It was highly calculating. It was the anger of an author outlining the perfect downfall of a villain. She wanted me to be interesting. She wanted to brag about experiencing the absolute best the world had to offer. I slowly slid my hand into the front pocket of my jeans. My fingers brushed against the heavy, solid metal of my wallet, finding the exact spot where the sleek, black digital key card to the massive Exuma villa was safely hidden away. I smiled, a small, dangerous curve of the lips. I thought to myself, you need to be very careful what you wish for, Bianca. You might just get a front row seat to a show you can't afford to watch. 2 hours later, the agonizing dinner was finally over. The drive home from my parents' house was completely silent, the radio turned off, but my mind was incredibly loud, racing with theories and observations. I couldn't shake the visual memory of the dinner. The specific, nervous way Derek had shielded his phone screen. The unmistakable, rigid tension around Bianca's eyes that contradicted her constant bragging. It didn't sit right with me. It felt like a badly written lie. I make my living writing psychological thrillers and deeply analyzing human behavior to craft believable characters. I know the distinct difference between the relaxed, unbothered posture of the genuinely wealthy and the rigid, terrifying tension of the deeply, hopelessly indebted. When I finally unlocked the door and walked into my dark apartment, I didn't bother changing into my pajamas. I didn't go to bed. I went straight down the hall into my home office. I brewed a massive pot of incredibly strong black coffee, turned on the overhead lights, and sat down in my leather chair in front of my glowing, 3-monitor workstation. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Let's see just exactly how magical your perfect life really is, Bianca," I whispered to the empty room. I started my investigation with the basics. Many people don't realize that public county records are a truly beautiful, incredibly revealing thing if you just know exactly where and how to look. And as a professional ghostwriter who often has to ruthlessly fact-check the exaggerated tall tales and fabricated histories of arrogant millionaire businessmen for their memoirs, I knew exactly which databases to access. I pulled up my web browser and navigated straight to the county clerk's official database for the affluent district where Bianca and Derek lived. I bypassed the standard searches and went straight for the property and tax records, typing in both of their full legal names. I hit the search key. I expected to find maybe a late payment or two, perhaps a minor dispute over a property line. Instead, the screen instantly populated with a long, scrolling list of massive red flags that made my eyebrows shoot all the way up to my hairline. The search results read like a financial obituary. Lien. Official notice of default. I clicked into the specific documents, downloading the PDFs to read the fine print. The massive, 5-bedroom colonial mansion in the exclusive gated community, the very same house that Bianca proudly posted glossy, curated photos of on her social media feed on a daily basis, was currently sitting squarely in pre-foreclosure status. The documents proved they hadn't paid a single dime toward their county property taxes in over 2 full years. Worse, I found records showing they had taken out a massive second mortgage on the property 18 months ago, bleeding the house dry of any remaining equity. As if that wasn't enough, there was a third, separate mechanics lien filed against the property by a local contractor who had apparently completely gutted and installed their custom backyard pool last summer, and had simply never been paid for his labor or materials. I leaned back in my heavy leather office chair, my eyes wide, taking a long, slow sip of my bitter black coffee. The grand illusion was shattering right before my eyes. The wildly expensive, family-first luxury yacht trip to the Mediterranean wasn't a joyful celebration of their financial abundance. It was a desperate, panicked distraction. It was the exact financial equivalent of a stage magician waving a brightly colored handkerchief high in the air with his right hand, purposely drawing everyone's attention, while his left hand quietly and efficiently picked the audience's collective pockets. But a burning question remained. Why the sudden, aggressive pressure on me tonight? Why did Bianca go out of her way to critique my clothes and push me to attract better opportunities? Historically, whenever Bianca felt secure and superior in her life, she simply ignored my existence entirely. The fact that she was suddenly hyper-focused on my finances and my earning potential meant she was heavily projecting her own desperate need for cash. I needed to dig deeper. I moved away from the property records and pulled up the official state business filings portal. I searched for the registration details of Bianca's much-boasted-about consulting company. The results loaded instantly. Her LLC, proudly named Lux Life Consulting, didn't just have a poor credit rating. It had been officially and permanently dissolved by the state government over 4 months ago due to her complete failure to file standard annual reports or pay the basic registration fees. Legally, her business did not exist. Yet, I knew for a fact her Instagram account was highly active. Just yesterday, she had been aggressively promoting an upcoming, highly exclusive summer mastermind retreat specifically designed for aspiring digital influencers. I opened a new tab, went to her social media profile, and clicked on the promotional link featured prominently in her bio. The promotional link in Bianca's social media bio directed me away from the app and onto a highly polished, incredibly glitzy external landing page. The website was completely saturated with soft pastel colors, elegant cursive fonts, and endless buzzwords about female empowerment and financial freedom. The main header text screamed in bold letters, demanding that visitors join Bianca for the ultimate luxury glow-up retreat. Beneath that, a secondary block of text promised 7 full days of intensive life coaching, elite content creation, and unparalleled networking in a heavily guarded, secret tropical paradise. I scrolled down to the pricing section. The tickets were listed at $5,000 per person. The website explicitly stated that there were only 10 exclusive spots available, creating a false sense of desperate urgency. Furthermore, a tiny clause at the bottom noted that all purchases were strictly non-refundable due to the incredibly high demand and exclusive nature of the venue. I frowned, leaning closer to the glowing screen of my central monitor. If Bianca and Derek were truly broke enough to be dodging aggressive county tax collectors and facing imminent foreclosure on their primary residence, they certainly couldn't afford to rent a venue that matched the lavish description on this website. A luxury venue capable of housing 10 high-maintenance influencers, complete with a private chef and oceanfront workshops, would easily cost tens of thousands of dollars to secure up front. They didn't have that kind of capital. Then, my eyes drifted over to the background images strategically placed throughout the sales pitch. My breath hitched in my throat. I stopped scrolling. The website's primary background image wasn't a generic, purchase stock photo of a random Caribbean beach like I had initially assumed. I clicked on the image, opening it in a new tab to view it at full resolution. It was my house. I felt a sudden, icy chill spread down my spine, replacing the lingering warmth of the coffee. Staring right back at me were highly professional, brightly lit photographs. They weren't stolen from my private social media because I hadn't posted any yet. They were the exact, high-resolution photographs taken directly from the luxury real estate listing I had used when I purchased the property a month ago. There was a wide shot of my spacious, open-concept living room with the floor-to-ceiling glass doors pushed wide open to the sea. There was a stunning drone shot of my private infinity pool seamlessly blending into the ocean. There was an intimate photo of the master bedroom suite. Bianca wasn't just planning a desperate, last-minute family vacation to save face. She had actively sold my house. She had confidently sold 10 expensive tickets to a week-long professional retreat at a massive estate she did not own, did not have legal permission to use, and hadn't even bothered to ask the actual owner about. The puzzle pieces clicked violently into place, forming a terrifying picture of sheer, unadulterated entitlement. Sienna hadn't just seen me at the airport with a designer bag. Sienna had likely snooped through my home office during one of their unannounced, patronizing drop-ins over the last few months. She must have seen the glossy real estate brochures on my desk, or caught a glimpse of my laptop screen, and immediately ran back to report the juicy gossip to her mother. Bianca must have found the public listing online weeks ago, realized it was the absolute perfect, photogenic venue for her fake guru scam, and boldly assumed she could easily bully, manipulate, or guilt-trip whoever owned it into letting her use it. But when Sienna confirmed that I was the one traveling to the Bahamas, Bianca must have thought she had hit the absolute jackpot. She genuinely believed I was a weak, pathetic pushover. She thought she could steamroll right over my boundaries, invite our parents along to apply family pressure, host her fraudulent retreat at my expense, quietly pocket the $50,000 in cash from the ticket sales, and quickly use that stolen money to pay off the massive tax liens on her own house before the bank finally kicked her out onto the street. It was a brilliant, incredibly audacious Ponzi scheme, entirely built on a foundation of toxic family guilt. I didn't panic. I went to work. I took high-resolution screenshots of every single inch of her website. I captured the dates, the stolen photos, the pricing structure, and the non-refundable clauses. I right-clicked and downloaded the page source code to legally prove the exact date the fraudulent website was created. I built a massive, undeniable digital dossier of her premeditated fraud. With the digital evidence safely secured in multiple encrypted folders on my hard drive, I decided it was time to officially test the waters. I needed to know exactly how much they knew, and I needed to force Bianca out of the shadows before she could orchestrate a massive ambush with our parents. I picked up my phone and opened my private Instagram account. I had preemptively blocked Bianca and Derek years ago for my own mental peace, but I had intentionally never blocked my niece, Sienna. I knew for a fact that Sienna still followed me, likely just to secretly monitor my feed so she could mock my supposedly boring posts about classic literature and obscure tea blends with her shallow college friends. I opened my phone's photo gallery and carefully selected a picture I had taken 3 weeks ago, right after I officially signed the closing papers. It was a stunning, wide-angle shot taken from the massive stone terrace of my new villa. The composition was flawless. It showed the crystal-clear water of the infinity pool blending absolutely seamlessly into the turquoise Bahamian horizon. A single, elegant glass of iced tea rested casually on the edge of the stone railing, catching the golden hour sunlight. I deliberately did not add a location tag. I did not use any hashtags. I simply typed a very short, very specific caption. Finally home. The absolute peace and quiet is worth every single penny. I hit the post button. Then I set my phone face up on the desk, leaned back in my chair, and stared directly at the digital clock on my bottom monitor. I didn't have to wait long. It took exactly 12 minutes. My phone screen lit up brightly, vibrating violently against the wood of the desk. The caller ID didn't say Sienna. It said Bianca. Sienna must have been obsessively watching my feed, or she had run screaming into the living room to shove her phone directly into her mother's face the second the photo went live. I let the phone ring 3 full times. I took a deep breath, consciously slowing my heart rate, deeply channeling the icy, impenetrable demeanor of the ruthless corporate protagonists I spent my life writing about. Then I calmly swiped the screen to answer. I said a simple, flat hello. Valerie? Bianca's voice practically vibrated through the speaker. It was high-pitched, incredibly breathless, and dripping with a manic, forced warmth. It was the exact, calculated tone she always used when she desperately wanted something from someone. She asked me what I was doing and immediately demanded to know where I was. I kept my voice completely devoid of emotion. I told her I was at home and asked her why she was calling so late. Bianca let out a loud, totally forced laugh. She said that Sienna had just shown her my recent post. She praised the picture, calling it absolutely incredible, but the underlying strain in her voice was painfully obvious. She aggressively pressed for details, asking where on earth the photo was taken, and jokingly suggesting that I had just found a pretty computer screensaver that I liked. Even when she was actively trying to manipulate me, the deep-seated urge to insult me was just a pure, reflexive habit for her. She literally couldn't help herself. I replied calmly, informing her that it wasn't a downloaded screensaver. I told her it was a raw, unfiltered photograph from my recent trip. The line went completely, utterly silent for a full 3 seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the fake warmth. She accused me of lying, reminding me that just a few hours ago at dinner, I had sworn I was only dropping a client off at the airport. I smoothly countered, saying that I was indeed working. I pointed out that the greatest beauty of being a highly successful writer is the ability to work from absolutely anywhere in the world. She wasn't buying the evasion. Her voice hardened into a sharp, demanding edge. She demanded to know the exact location, stating that the view looked exactly like the Exumas or perhaps Turks and Caicos. She aggressively pried into my personal life, asking who I was staying with. She practically sneered as she asked if I had finally found myself a rich boyfriend to fund my life. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I leaned closer to the phone's microphone, ensuring my enunciation was razor-sharp. "It is my house, Bianca," I said clearly. The silence that followed that statement was heavy, absolute, and deeply, viscerally satisfying. I could actually hear her rapid, panicked breathing echoing through the tiny speaker. She finally sputtered, her voice dropping a full octave in pure shock. She stammered out a question, asking if I had just said it was my house. I confirmed it. I told her I bought it last month and made sure to emphasize that it was paid for entirely in cash, in full. Bianca let out a sharp, incredibly loud, incredulous cackle. It sounded borderline hysterical. She yelled my name, commanding me to stop lying. She listed off my supposed flaws, reminding me that I drove an old Honda and shopped for basic clothes at cheap department stores. She practically screamed into the phone, asking if I seriously expected her to believe I had casually bought a multi-million-dollar beachfront villa. She mockingly asked if I had secretly won the lottery. I didn't raise my voice. I matched her hysteria with absolute, crushing calm. I told her I earned every single penny of it. I explained that 10 solid years of aggressive saving, smart corporate investing, and writing multiple best-selling novels under a secret pseudonym paid significantly better than her fake Instagram lifestyle ever could. She trailed off, muttering the word best-selling under her breath. I could practically hear the rusty gears grinding in her head. She was rapidly, violently recalibrating her entire perception of reality. The pathetic sister she had mercilessly mocked for a decade, the boring, broke failure of the family, was currently sitting on a literal gold mine. Then, the ultimate pivot happened. It was so fast it gave me whiplash. She screamed, "Oh my God," into the phone, a massive explosion of fake, overwhelming joy practically shattering the speaker. She called it amazing news and immediately demanded to know why I had kept it a secret. She effortlessly slipped into the role of the caring sister, claiming they had all been so terribly worried about me struggling, while I had secretly been hiding this massive success. She invoked our parents, saying how incredibly proud they were going to be. I cut through her fake joy, stating simply that I didn't tell them because I highly value my personal privacy. She dismissed my boundary instantly, waving away the word privacy as if it were a joke. She called the news huge and then, without missing a single beat, she launched her trap. She smoothly transitioned, stating that the timing was absolutely perfect. She claimed that she and Derek were just discussing how desperately they needed a real, private vacation this summer to get away from the noisy crowds. She even had the audacity to call the luxury yacht trip they had just taken too commercial, stating they needed a place to truly reconnect as a family. She didn't ask for permission. She just aggressively assumed ownership of my assets. She began rapidly planning out loud, saying they would all come down in mid-July. She mentioned that the kids would be off from school, and she could probably secure cheap flights if she booked them right away. She even had the nerve to ask if my new house came fully staffed, or if she needed to bring her own personal assistant. I cut her off with a single, sharp word. No. She stopped her frantic planning. She sounded genuinely confused, asking me what I meant by no. I enunciated every single syllable carefully. I told her that no, she and her family were absolutely not coming to my property in July. She laughed nervously, telling me not to be silly. She aggressively reminded me that we were family, and families always celebrate major financial successes together. Then, the entitlement truly reared its ugly head. She told me that I owed them. She claimed they had been desperately trying to include me in their luxurious lifestyle for years, and now that I finally had something of value, it was my absolute duty to host them. She declared it would be our little family housewarming party. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles ached. I reminded her that she had actively, maliciously excluded me from her life for 10 entire years. I reminded her that she had repeatedly told me I was far too poor to be seen with her. I reminded her of Aspen and how she had told Derek I would only embarrass them. She immediately played the victim, crying out that it was all just harmless teasing. She accused me of being far too sensitive and holding on to petty grudges. I corrected her instantly. "I'm not being sensitive," I said. "I'm being highly selective. You cannot stay at the villa." Her fake sweetness evaporated in a millisecond, instantly replaced by the raw, toxic entitlement I knew so intimately. She demanded to know why. She aggressively questioned if I had already rented it out to strangers and ordered me to immediately cancel the bookings because family always comes first. I leaned closer to the microphone. I told her it wasn't rented out. I explained that I just have a very strict, uncompromising policy regarding who I allow onto my private property. She furiously demanded to know what my policy was. I took a deep breath and delivered the exact line I had been saving for 10 years. I only allow people into my home who are genuinely successful and authentic, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. And frankly, Bianca, your entire existence, the fake wealth, the crushing credit card debt, and pretending to be a millionaire while your actual house goes into foreclosure, is just completely pathetic. We are not celebrating, Bianca. You are not moving in. Sorry, but my life is totally out of your league. I hit the red button and ended the call. I stared at the black screen of my phone resting on the mahogany desk. My heart was racing wildly in my chest, but it wasn't pumping with fear or anxiety. It was flooded with pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I had finally done it. I had finally spoken the absolute, unvarnished truth directly to her face. But I am a woman who writes psychological thrillers for a living. I know exactly how these specific character archetypes operate. I knew the story was far from over. A deeply insecure narcissist who is suddenly and violently denied their ultimate source of supply is an incredibly dangerous, unpredictable thing. And I had just firmly locked the heavy iron door on the biggest financial supply she had ever laid her greedy eyes on. The immediate fallout was nuclear. Within less than 20 minutes, my phone began vibrating continuously, practically dancing across the surface of the desk. The screen was completely flooded with a rapid-fire barrage of frantic text messages from my mother. The preview text on the screen painted a chaotic picture. Valerie, you need to answer your phone right this second. Your sister is lying on the floor crying hysterically. How could you possibly be so incredibly cruel and selfish? We are driving over to your apartment right now to sort this mess out. I calmly picked up the phone and completely muted the notification thread. I wasn't going to sit in my quiet, safe sanctuary and let them ambush me in my own home, screaming at me until I caved to their insane demands. That was the old dynamic, and that dynamic was dead. Instead, I turned back to my computer screens. I needed to finish assembling the weapon. Bianca's immediate reaction on the phone had been far too desperate. Yes, she was notoriously entitled, and demanding free things was her standard operating procedure. But the sheer, aggressive speed at which she tried to lock in the exact dates of mid-July felt highly specific and incredibly panicked. I pulled up the captured screenshots of the fake Lux Life Retreat website again. I zoomed in on the detailed itinerary section listed near the bottom of the page. The advertised dates for the retreat were boldly listed as July 15th through July 22nd. I cross-referenced those exact dates with an email from my Bahamian property management company. Those were the exact dates I had previously blocked off on my own private calendar for routine pool maintenance and a deep cleaning of the villa's air conditioning units. The house was scheduled to be completely empty. I looked at the venue name listed on her fake website. It proudly advertised a stay at the exclusive Sapphire Cove estate. My blood ran completely cold. Sapphire Cove wasn't just a generic, made-up marketing name. It was the actual, legal name of the highly exclusive, gated beachfront development where my new villa was located. It was a very small, private community consisting of only 6 luxury homes situated on a secluded strip of private beach. She wasn't just vaguely hoping to secure a house in the Bahamas. She had actively built a massive, fraudulent business venture specifically around my exact property, down to the name of the private road. I opened a new, secure document file. I began compiling a comprehensive, devastating dossier. I organized the county foreclosure notices on her primary residence. I attached the official state documents proving her limited liability company had been legally dissolved months ago. I included the full source code and high-resolution screenshots of the fraudulent retreat website, clearly highlighting the $5,000 non-refundable ticket price and the stolen photographs of my private bedroom. Finally, I printed out a stark, uncompromising legal summary of the Federal Trade Commission's strict guidelines regarding wire fraud and the illegal sale of services that one does not actually possess. I arranged the thick stack of papers meticulously, placed them inside a heavy, dark blue legal folder, and clipped it shut. The following morning, the sun was shining brightly, completely ignorant of the massive storm about to make landfall. I dressed carefully. I didn't wear my usual comfortable riding clothes. I put on a perfectly tailored, dark charcoal designer blazer and a crisp, blindingly white silk blouse. I looked exactly like the wealthy, ruthless corporate ghostwriter I truly was. I picked up the blue folder, locked my apartment door, and drove my old, reliable Honda straight to my parents' sprawling suburban house. I knew with absolute certainty that Bianca would be there. Whenever she broke something expensive or got herself into a mess she couldn't manipulate her way out of, she always ran straight back to Mommy and Daddy to fix it. Today, nobody was going to be able to fix it. I didn't bother knocking. I used the spare key I had kept on my ring since college and pushed the heavy oak front door open. When I walked into the living room, the atmosphere was incredibly thick, heavy, and decidedly funereal. The bright, cheerful family yacht photos on the mantelpiece felt like a cruel, mocking joke in contrast to the dark mood in the room. My mother, Margaret, was sitting tensely at the large dining table, nervously wringing her hands together, her face pale and drawn. My father, Richard, was pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, his brow deeply furrowed in anger. Bianca was dramatically slumped on the center cushion of the large leather sofa. Her eyes were artificially red and puffy, and she was clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest like a dying Victorian heroine. She had intentionally worn a pair of oversized, faded sweatpants, a truly rare, calculated sight designed specifically to visually broadcast her immense emotional suffering. Derek was standing directly behind the sofa, his arms tightly crossed over his chest, looking exactly like a menacing, overweight bodyguard hired to protect a tragedy. The moment the front door clicked shut behind me, Derek immediately uncrossed his arms and pointed a thick finger at me. He spat my name, loudly declaring that I had a lot of absolute nerve showing my face there after what I had done to his wife the night before. My mother stood up from the table, her voice trembling violently. She begged me to sit down, dramatically gesturing toward a chair, claiming that my sister was in a terrible, fragile state because of my cruel words. I didn't move toward the chair. I stood firmly in the center of the room, tightly clutching the dark blue folder against my side. I kept my posture completely straight and my voice level. I told my mother I was perfectly fine standing. Bianca let out a loud, piercing wail. She looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, playing her victim role to absolute perfection. She wailed about how she had excitedly told all her close friends about my amazing new house. She cried that she had proudly bragged about how her highly successful sister was finally inviting the family to stay, and then accused me of viciously humiliating her for absolutely no reason. She sobbed, asking how I could call her a pathetic failure after everything she had supposedly done to support me over the years. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked down at her and calmly asked her to name one single thing she had ever actually done for me, other than ruthlessly draining our parents' retirement accounts to fund her delusions. My father stopped his pacing abruptly. He barked at me, telling me that was absolutely enough. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and sternly lectured me, claiming that sudden money clearly changes people, but he never thought it would turn his daughter into such a heartless monster. He reiterated the golden rule of their toxic dynamic: if I possessed a large luxury house, family was automatically entitled to use it. Period. I looked my father directly in the eyes. I told him it wasn't just a house, and this wasn't just a simple family vacation. Bianca shrieked from the sofa, her voice completely losing its fragile, breathy quality. She yelled that I was just deeply, obsessively jealous. She screamed to our parents that I had always been intensely jealous of her beautiful life, her wealthy friends, and her glamorous career. She accused me of wanting to hoard all my secret money just so I could finally feel superior to her for once in my pathetic life. I let her finish her frantic, screaming rant. The silence echoed in the room for a brief second. I don't care about your fake career, Bianca, I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, icy register. But I strongly suspect the Federal Trade Commission and the County Tax Fraud Division might care quite a bit. With a swift, practiced motion, I lifted the heavy blue folder and threw it forcefully onto the glass coffee table in front of the sofa. It landed with a sharp, incredibly loud, authoritative slap that made everyone in the room physically flinch. Derek stepped out from behind the sofa, his face flushed with anger. He aggressively demanded to know what kind of garbage I had brought into his in-laws' house. I didn't back down. I looked him dead in the eye and issued a direct challenge. "Open it," I commanded. Derek aggressively snatched the folder off the glass table and flipped it open, fully preparing to sneer at whatever petty grievance he thought I had printed out. Instead, he went completely, utterly silent. His eyes rapidly scanned the top document. It was the high-resolution printout of the Lux Life Retreat website, clearly displaying the stolen photos of my house and the $5,000 price tag. I watched closely as the angry red flush violently drained from Derek's face, leaving him looking like a sick, gray ghost. I turned my attention entirely back to the woman on the sofa. I spoke clearly, ensuring every single word hung heavily in the air. "You sold tickets, Bianca," I said. "You actively sold 10 exclusive tickets at $5,000 a head to strangers on the internet. You legally promised them a luxury stay at the Sapphire Cove estate. My private estate." Bianca completely froze. The theatrical, heaving tears stopped instantly, as if someone had violently flipped a switch inside her brain. The color drained from her face and genuine, unfiltered, primal panic finally set in. I didn't let her speak. I relentlessly drove the facts home. "You do not have a venue," I continued, my voice echoing off the walls. "You illegally collected $50,000 from innocent people, and you explicitly made the tickets non-refundable. You have absolutely nowhere to put these women. You were desperately banking on me being the nice, quiet, traumatized little sister who would just roll over, cry, and let you illegally hijack my multi-million-dollar property for a week just so you could play your fake internet guru games." My mother slowly pushed her chair back. She walked hesitantly over to Derek and looked down at the stack of printed papers in his trembling hands. She looked back at Bianca, her voice tiny and terrified. She asked Bianca if it was true, if she had actually stolen money from strangers on the internet. Bianca scrambled up from the sofa, moving frantically. She started lying immediately, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a desperate rush. She looked at our parents and swore she was planning to pay me. She wildly claimed it was just a smart business proposition and that she was going to generously give me a cut of the profits. I shut the lie down instantly. "You aggressively demanded to stay for free," I reminded her loudly. "You literally said on the phone that it was a family vacation and that I owed it to you." Bianca completely lost control. Her carefully curated mask violently shattered into a million pieces. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know why I had to be such a massive, vindictive problem. She yelled that I had a huge, empty house and that she had desperate people flying in from across the country in just 3 weeks. She screamed that if she was forced to cancel the event now, she would lose absolutely everything. I looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You have already lost everything, Bianca," I said coldly. I reached over and flipped to the second page in the folder. It was the official county notice. I saw the massive tax liens I revealed, my voice cutting through the room like a razor blade. "I downloaded the official pre-foreclosure notice on your 5-bedroom mansion. Your consulting company was legally dissolved months ago. You are completely broke. You are aggressively drowning in debt. And instead of acting like an adult, you desperately tried to use my life savings as a free life raft, without even having the basic human decency to ask for my permission first." The living room went dead silent. It was a suffocating, terrifying quiet. All the oxygen seemed to have been violently sucked out of the large space. My parents looked back and forth from my calm, collected face to Bianca's manic, panicked expression. Their faces were frozen masks of absolute shock. They had absolutely no idea. For an entire decade, they had completely bought into the glamorous, wealthy lie just as blindly as Bianca's thousands of naive internet followers had. "Tax liens?" My father whispered, the words barely making it past his lips. He looked at his eldest daughter as if he were seeing a total stranger. "Bianca? Foreclosure?" Bianca looked completely trapped, like a rat backed tightly into a corner. She looked desperately up at Derek, pleading for him to jump in and violently defend her honor like he always did. But Derek wasn't looking at her. He was staring blankly down at his expensive leather shoes, his hands shaking so violently the papers in the folder rustled loudly. She finally looked at me, her eyes completely filled with a dark, pure, unadulterated hatred. She hissed at me, her voice dripping with venom, accusing me of ruining her entire life. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said softly. "I didn't ruin anything. I just finally turned on the bright lights in the dark room." The tense silence that immediately followed my massive revelation about the unpaid taxes and the fraudulent retreat didn't last very long. It was merely a brief intake of breath before the true, devastating explosion occurred. It wasn't Bianca who broke the silence. It was Derek. He didn't yell. His voice was shockingly low, a terrifying, guttural rumble that made Bianca visibly flinch. It was the very first time in 10 years I had ever heard him use that specific tone with his wife. Usually, he was just a loud, obnoxious echo of her desires. Today, he sounded exactly like a man who was desperately trying to avoid a federal prison sentence. He looked up from his shoes and locked eyes with my mother. He told Bianca to shut up. He said that since I had exposed the house situation, the massive legal liability had just fundamentally changed. He turned toward my parents, his face slick with a cold sweat. He pointed a heavy, trembling finger directly at his wife. He told the room that the $50,000 from the fake ticket sales wasn't sitting safely in a bank account waiting to be refunded. He swallowed hard and confessed, "It's completely gone." Bianca let out a pathetic whimper, backing away from him. Derek relentlessly exposed her. He yelled that she had already spent every single penny of the $50,000. He listed off the absurd expenses: a massive personal branding refresh, a brand new designer wardrobe specifically purchased for the Bahamas trip, and a massive, non-refundable cash deposit on a luxury rental car they didn't even need on a tiny island. Bianca tried to weakly defend herself, crying out that she had to look the part of a successful guru for her wealthy clients. Derek ignored her completely. He turned back to my mother, Margaret, who was leaning heavily against the dining table for physical support. His voice cracked as he asked her a very specific, devastating question. "Margaret," he asked slowly, "did you happen to authorize a massive wire transfer of $15,000 from your joint retirement savings account late last month?" My mother gasped audibly. Her hand flew up to violently cover her mouth. She shook her head frantically, her eyes wide with terror. She stammered that she absolutely did not authorize anything. She cried that the specific account was strictly locked away, intended only for dire medical emergencies. Derek let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "Well, it's completely gone," he stated flatly. He turned his blazing eyes back to Bianca, officially delivering the final, fatal blow to her golden child status. He revealed that Bianca had criminally forged our mother's signature on a complicated bank transfer request. He explained that she had lied to the bank teller, claiming the money was desperately needed for an emergency medical procedure. Instead, she had immediately used the stolen $15,000 to quietly pay off the massive minimum balances on her maxed-out credit cards, strictly so the cards wouldn't get humiliatingly declined while they were out buying expensive champagne on the family yacht trip. Stealing generic funds from a collective family pot or demanding free vacations was one thing. Actively forging a signature to illegally drain elderly parents' secure retirement savings was a literal, undeniable felony. My father stood up very slowly. His knees popped loudly in the quiet room. He looked down at Bianca, his ultimate favorite daughter, the intensely special one he had always protected. The look of utter, profound horror on his aging face is something I will never, ever forget. He asked her, his voice breaking into a sob, if she had actually stolen money from them. Bianca's face completely crumpled. She frantically denied the word steal. She cried that she merely borrowed it. She desperately rationalized her felony, claiming she was absolutely going to pay it all back with the massive profits from the Bahamas retreat. She aggressively pointed at me, hysterically screaming that it was entirely my fault. She yelled that if I had just simply let her host the retreat for a few days, she could have paid everyone back and fixed the entire mess. She lunged violently across the coffee table toward me, grabbing my left arm with a desperate, painful, claw-like grip. She screamed directly into my face, calling me a selfish, boring, jealous little spinster. She demanded that I give her the keys to the villa immediately to fix the problem I had supposedly created. I didn't flinch. I didn't try to pull away. I looked calmly down at her manicured hand digging painfully into my jacket, and then back up into her heavily tear-streaked, completely unhinged face. I gently, but incredibly firmly, peeled her shaking fingers off my arm, one by one. I told her plainly that I was absolutely not the one who needed to fix this mess. I reminded her that I was completely solvent. And I pointed out that, currently, I was the only person standing in this room who wasn't actively drowning in federal crimes. I took one step back toward the front door. I looked around the completely shattered room and dropped the final, inescapable anchor. I informed them that early this morning, I had officially contacted the digital hosting platform she used to sell the tickets. I told them I had formally reported the active listing as a massive financial fraud, providing them with the exact property deed proving my ownership. I stated calmly that the platform was aggressively shutting down her account and forcibly issuing full financial refunds to every single guest, pulling the money directly from her heavily overdrawn bank accounts as we speak. The fake retreat was officially canceled. The grand illusion was permanently over. Bianca stared at me for a long, agonizing heartbeat. Her eyes darted around the room, desperately waiting for someone to laugh, waiting for me to suddenly announce it was all just a cruel, elaborate joke. But when the crushing reality finally hit her, when she realized I was completely serious, that the stolen retreat money was already gone, that the furious ticket platform would be aggressively coming after her for the massive funds she had already foolishly spent on clothes, and that her husband and her parents finally knew the absolute, ugly truth about her finances and her felonies, she physically collapsed. She didn't faint gracefully or elegantly like the tragic actresses she used to pretend to be. She just violently slid down the side of the leather sofa onto the expensive rug, sobbing with ugly, guttural, heaving breaths, tightly curling herself into a small, pathetic ball like a terrified toddler. Derek looked down at his wife lying on the floor. The expression on his face was a complex, disturbing war between utter disgust and deep, pathetic pity. He slowly looked up at me. He quietly swore that he had absolutely no idea about the forged bank signature. I looked at him coldly. I told him I believed him about the forgery. But I sharply reminded him that he was fully aware of the fake, extravagant lifestyle. He knew the massive mortgage wasn't being paid. I pointed out that he deeply enjoyed the luxury yacht, and that he had happily drank the expensive champagne while his life completely burned down around him. Derek slowly nodded his head, looking completely, utterly defeated. He whispered a quiet agreement. My father didn't say another word to me. He silently turned his back on the chaos in the room and walked slowly over to the large living room window, staring blankly out at the manicured suburban lawn. My mother sat heavily back down in her chair, burying her face in her trembling hands, loudly weeping into the quiet room. The untouchable golden child of the family had finally, spectacularly fallen from grace, and she had violently shattered absolutely everything on her way down. I didn't offer any meaningless words of comfort. I simply turned around, walked out the front door, and drove back to my quiet, boring, wonderfully solvent life. The subsequent unraveling of Bianca's highly curated life over the next few months was incredibly fast, brutally efficient, and entirely self-inflicted. With the fake mastermind retreat officially canceled and the angry ticket platform aggressively demanding the immediate legal repayment of the full $50,000, Bianca and Derek were backed into an inescapable corner. They had absolutely no liquid cash, maxed out credit, and zero assets left to leverage. Within 30 days, they had no choice but to officially file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in federal court. The sprawling, 5-bedroom colonial mansion in the exclusive gated community was officially foreclosed upon by the angry bank just 3 short months later. They were aggressively evicted. They were forced to pack up their remaining cheap belongings and move into a cramped, depressing two-bedroom rental apartment located on the far, industrial edge of the city. It was a stark, humiliating cry from the elite lifestyle they had previously staked their entire personal identities on. Surprisingly, Derek didn't divorce her. However, the fundamental dynamic of their toxic marriage shifted permanently. Derek took absolute, rigid control of their ruined finances. Bianca was strictly cut off from all access to credit cards. Worse for her ego, Bianca was forced to get a job. Not a glamorous consulting gig, but a real, humiliatingly normal job. Through a mutual connection, I heard she is currently working 40 hours a week as a basic front desk receptionist at a busy local dental office. The family gossip dictates that she absolutely hates every second of it. She is required to wear standard, unflattering medical scrubs every day. I heard she desperately tries to save face by actively lying to the dental patients, casually telling people she is just temporarily helping out a close friend who owns the medical practice. But everyone in our hometown knows the exact, brutal truth. My parents were the ones whose reaction surprised me the most in the bitter aftermath. For several long weeks immediately following the explosive confrontation in their living room, they remained completely silent and distant. The immense shame of what had happened was simply too thick for them to navigate. They had to painfully process the reality that they had actively enabled a manipulative monster for over 40 years, constantly feeding her endless entitlement while simultaneously starving their other daughter of basic validation and love. Facing that specific, ugly reality is arguably much harder than facing a bankruptcy judge. Eventually, the financial reality of Bianca's felony hit them. To avoid pressing federal criminal charges against their own daughter and sending her to prison for the forged bank wire, my parents were forced to quietly sell the large suburban house they had lived in for 30 years. They used the equity to absorb the $15,000 loss and help pay off a fraction of the remaining debt Bianca had maliciously tricked them into. They permanently downsized, moving into a very small, quiet retirement condo on the other side of the state. One warm, incredibly peaceful evening in late August, exactly 1 full year after the massive family explosion, I was sitting alone on the expansive stone terrace of my private villa in Exuma. The tropical sun was slowly setting over the horizon, dramatically painting the vast, cloudless sky in violent, breathtaking shades of deep violet, burnt orange, and soft pink. The massive ocean stretched out before me, looking exactly like a flawless sheet of perfectly polished blue glass. The only sound in the world was the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the warm waves against the private shore and the soft rustling of the palm leaves in the ocean breeze. I was sitting at an outdoor teak table, happily working on editing the final, thrilling chapter of my highly anticipated next novel, when my personal phone buzzed softly against the wood. I picked it up. It was a long, unexpected text message from my mother. "We are so incredibly sorry, Valerie, for absolutely everything," the message read. "We were completely, foolishly blind for so many years. We are finally settled into the new condo. It is significantly smaller, but it is quiet, and it is safely ours." A few seconds later, a second, shorter text message popped up on the screen. "You are not boring. You never were. You are the rock of this family. We love you." I stared silently at the glowing screen for a long time. I listened to the ocean. I didn't aggressively type out a reply immediately. I simply reached over, took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my expensive red wine, an excellent vintage that I had proudly paid for entirely in cash, and let her heavy words truly settle into my bones. Validation from your family is an incredibly tricky, complicated thing. When you have desperately craved it and starved for it for decades, finally getting it feels significantly less like a massive, victorious triumph and much more like a profound, exhausting sigh of physical relief. I didn't need them to think I was an interesting person anymore. I already knew I was. Over the spring break that year, I had completely shocked the family by quietly inviting my niece Sienna and my nephew Julian to fly down to the Bahamas villa for a week. I explicitly stated that their toxic parents were absolutely not invited. When the kids first arrived on the island, they were incredibly stiff and awkward. They were fully expecting to meet the sad, bitter Aunt Valerie they had been relentlessly told about their entire lives, the boring, judgmental spinster. But after a full week of swimming in the private coral reef, learning how to cook fresh, expensive lobster in the massive outdoor kitchen, and sitting by the fire pit truly talking about their fears and their actual futures without their mother hovering over them, I watched them fundamentally change. Sienna sat by the fire one night, looking out at the massive estate. She quietly admitted that her mother had always viciously claimed I was just incredibly lucky and that I selfishly hoarded my money. I had looked at my niece, poked the fire with a stick, and told her the truth. I told her I don't hoard money. I deeply respect it. And more importantly, I told her I respected myself entirely too much to ever waste my energy pretending to be something I wasn't for the approval of strangers. Sienna had nodded slowly. She confessed that she didn't want to be a fake social media influencer anymore, admitting that the constant lying seemed utterly exhausting. I smiled and told her to go be something real, because it always pays significantly better in the long run. The absolute final, crushing blow to Bianca's massive ego came not directly from me, but from the very glamorous entertainment industry she had tried so desperately to infiltrate her entire adult life. A few short months ago, I finally released my brand new book. It was a massive, risky departure from my usual corporate thrillers. It was a deeply emotional, semi-autobiographical fiction novel about a toxic family violently torn apart by a deeply narcissistic, abusive sibling and the quiet, boring sister who ultimately rises above the chaos to claim her peace. The dedication page simply read, "Dedicated to the boring ones." Within 2 weeks of publication, the novel hit the absolute #1 spot on the New York Times bestseller list. Bianca actually had the absolute audacity to call my private cell phone the very morning the prestigious list was officially published online. I didn't answer. I casually let it go straight to voicemail. She left a frantic, 3-minute message. Her voice was sickly sweet, completely ignoring the fact that she hadn't spoken to me in a year. She desperately asked if I needed to hire a professional publicist or an experienced manager to help handle my massive newfound fame and wealth. She was still, even after losing absolutely everything, aggressively looking for an unearned angle to exploit. I didn't bother calling her back. I simply hit the delete button, erasing her voice from my life forever. I calmly packed up my laptop, grabbed a towel, and walked barefoot down the warm stone path toward the private beach. The ocean water was incredibly warm. The tropical sun was blindingly bright. And my life was exactly, perfectly as I had meticulously designed it to be. It was completely private. It was deeply peaceful. And it was fully, undeniably paid for. My family had spent 10 long years relentlessly calling me a boring person. Looking back on it all now, as I watched the waves gently roll into the white sand, I suppose they were absolutely right. Quiet peace is incredibly boring to people who biologically thrive on constant, destructive chaos. Total financial solvency is incredibly boring to people who are fatally addicted to the adrenaline of massive debt. And unwavering personal integrity is incredibly boring to people who spend their entire lives desperately living lies. And honestly, as I closed my eyes and listened to the wind, I wouldn't have it any other way.